All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is our lecture for the first half of chapter 22, and hopefully you have all of your stuff in front of you and you are ready to go, okay? So, alrighty, chapter 22 is Fighting the Four Freedoms, World War II, and our years, because this is U.S. involvement, is 1941 to 1945, okay? Well, I sounded a little congested today. Sorry about that. Okie dokie. So for chapter 21, we left off talking about the Great Depression, and I said that, you know, with the New Deal and stuff that was being implemented during that time, it was helpful in cushioning the effects of the Great Depression, but really it would be World War II that would bring about the end of the Depression, because then, you know, everybody had to focus on this war that's going on. Okay, so that's kind of where we are getting into chapter 22. Okay, so our first slide here is Fighting World War II. I feel like this chapter will seem like I'm kind of glazing over a lot, but that's because, you know, this was primarily a war overseas, and so I'll kind of get through European and Pacific aspects a little quicker, and then we'll focus on the home front a little bit more, okay? But anyway, so fighting World War II, okay? In the 1930s in the United States, we were mostly preoccupied with the Depression, which we know, and there was little focus on international affairs. Okay, so obviously the Depression is affecting the entire United States. Okay, so yeah, we're not looking outward so much at this point. But while everything that's going on in the US with the Depression, there are a couple of different things that are also going on that will culminate with the beginning of World War II. Okay, so for on our Eastern Front, looking at Japan and kind of what was going on with them, they had expanded their empire into Manchuria and China by the mid-1930s, and this becomes violent pretty early on. And if you've ever heard of the Rape of Nanjing, this is this military campaign that happened, in 1937. And it was a massacre of approximately 300,000 people. But so this is kind of this first push of Japanese militancy into China, and so sorry, pardon me, congested there. And this creates a lot of the conflict in what will become the Pacific War. Okay. Okay, so that's happening with Japan. And then in Europe, which we had talked about with the end of World War I and the reparations that were expected to be paid to the Allied powers by Germany, and they are in extreme debt. They default on their payments to the Allied powers, and they're just kind of in shambles. And this is whenever Hitler seizes power and is able to rise fairly quickly, because everything is in such chaos and shambles, like I already said. I'll just use that term again. But it's pretty easy for him to kind of step in and seize that power, okay? So this begins really in 1923, and his first push was known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And like I said, because of what was happening in Germany at this time, it's easy for him to rise to power. And then also there's a lot of inaction from Britain, France, and the United States, so our allied powers. There's a lot of inaction in opposing what they saw was going on in Germany, okay? This specifically starts in the Rhineland, which is our demilitarized zone between France and Germany that was established after World War I. And after he comes to power pretty early on, there is anti-Semitic rhetoric entering the dialogue of our Nazi party, okay? So early on, this is revealed to be a goal of Hitler, which we will see as we get through the war some more, but reveals itself pretty early on is the point of what I'm saying, okay? So for the United States, FDR, he is tied to this policy of isolationism. You know, like I said, this is an international conflict, but we are not trying to get involved. We're dealing with the Depression and what's going on over here. And many Americans were reluctant to get involved because of the legacy of World War I, okay? Basically, we're one generation down the road, and people still remember, okay? Alrighty, so what is going on in Europe? Which we will get more into what's happening with Russia, over our next couple of chapters, especially as we get into the Cold War. But early on, Joseph Stalin, who is in charge of our Soviet Union, the USSR, he signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, who had been a former enemy during World War I, okay? And Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. This is the beginning of World War II, okay? So they invade Poland, and Britain and France declare war against Germany. This invasion that is launched by the Germans is known as the Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And, from September 1st, from the moment this began, they appeared to be unstoppable, which the majority of the war, they will be viewed as unstoppable by most people. It's really not until the end that things kind of turn. But anyway, so the Germans are very powerful at this point in time, okay? Very quickly, they overrun Poland, Scandinavia, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all right? And that push, whenever they go through the Netherlands, is whenever we get Anne Frank's story. She comes out of that point in time, okay? Alrighty, by June of 1940, okay, so less than a year into the war, Hitler dominated nearly all of Europe and North Africa. They seized Paris in July of 1940, and in September of that same year, Germany, Italy, and Japan create our Axis powers, all right? So our alliance. Yes, all right. So for nearly 2 years, Britain stood virtually alone in fighting Germany. Remember, U.S. is still practicing isolationism, even though, Britain was reaching out for help. We're focused on things here, it really won't be until Pearl Harbor that we will get involved. But so at this point in time, Britain is fighting Germany, okay? And so this then leads, 1941, the German Air Force, the Lufthansa, then led an assault on London, okay? So the Battle of Britain, and if you guys are familiar, maybe you grew up with the Narnia series like I did, but if you remember, the kids are sent out of London to go to the countryside. This was during this German assault on London and other cities, okay? But anyway, so Britain then becomes the next main target for the Nazis, pardon me. Okay, so toward intervention, U.S. is realizing that this is becoming a bigger and bigger affair. War is broken out at this point. So we're kind of moving towards intervention, okay? Most Americans wanted to remain out of the European conflict. Like I said, they were still remembering World War I. And there's kind of what's known as the cash and carry system in play, in which this is a cash-only system of supporting Britain and their goods, but they had to be shipped in British ships. So the U.S. economy is supporting this, but it's considered to be British trade. Okay, so it's kind of this roundabout way. Okay. All right, in 1940, breaking with long-standing tradition, Roosevelt announced his candidacy for a third term. He's the only president to do that. Okay. And Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, which authorized military aid as long as countries repaid debts after the war. So anybody who promised that they could repay, anything that was loaned to them, would pretty much receive American support. Okay, and FDR froze Japanese assets, halting virtually all trade, which included oil. All right, which is a huge asset. All right, even today, oil is a huge part of our economy. All right, like it or not, it's there. Okay, so they freeze these assets, they halt trade on oil, and the Japanese government is livid. All right, so how do they react? Well, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes, which were launched from aircraft carriers in the Pacific, bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And in a few hours, 2,000 servicemen were killed, 187 aircraft, 18 naval vessels, and 8 battleships were destroyed in these few hours. Okay. So as a result of that, FDR asked for a declaration of war against Japan. So Congress votes on this. 477 people are in support of this. 1 is opposed. And Germany declared war on the United States the next day. All right. So we are now in the war. Alrighty. So the war in the Pacific, which is where this starts. So thinking about Pearl Harbor. Okay. In the first few months of American involvement, we witnessed an unbroken string of military disasters. Like I said, Germany at this point is still very strong, viewed to be unbeatable, and the U.S. comes into this and we're not doing great to begin with. Okay. There is a series of Japanese conquests in the Pacific in 1942. So, in addition to Germany, they're allied with Japan, who's dominating the Pacific. Okay, so I'm getting it from both fronts. And it really isn't until 1942 that the tide turns with the battles at Coral Sea and Midway. So it's May and June of 1942. And that's, when the tide starts to turn, and the attitude that Germany and Japan might be defeated kind of becomes, there's like a little glimmer. All right. Okay. So the war in Europe. Okay. Major involvement of American troops did not begin until D-Day. So this is June 6, 1944, in which 200,000 U.S., British, and Canadian forces, primarily Canadian, all right, but so 200,000 land in France and Normandy, and within the next few weeks, another million would follow, okay? So D-Day established the much-needed second front in Western Europe. So like I said, tide is turning, kind of becomes viewed that maybe there's a chance that Germany could be defeated, and that's whenever the second front comes in and kind of solidifies that, okay? So German troops begin retreating after this, and by August, Paris was liberated, all right? The crucial fighting in Europe took place on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union. So like I said, Soviet Union, we will talk about more over time, but anyway, so January 1943, Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. And yeah, looking, as a whole, there were 13.6 million German casualties in this arena of the war, and there were 10 million Russian casualties. Okay, so as a whole, it's estimated that between 70 and 90 million people died during World War II, different reasons. So there are 6 million alone as a result of the Holocaust, so it's just in Europe. 20 million Russians, 10 million on the front, and then those who are sent to labor camps, and yeah. But so overall, it is an estimated 70 to 90 million. And so that's kind of what is happening abroad. So the last thing I'll say for this video and then for the second half of the chapter is the home front. So how did the war affect everybody else in the United States? Because it did impacted everybody, whether or not you were going overseas to fight, everyone had someone in their family that was involved in some aspect, going overseas, working in the factory system, especially in regards to women. But so the home front is impacted during the war, all right? Okay, so let me just say real quick. Okay, on the home front. So mobilizing for war. The Army exemplified how the war united American society. The war effort created 3 million jobs. So like I said, this does in fact impact individuals in the United States. So this creates 3 million jobs. And the unemployment rate during the war dropped from 14%. So remember, we were coming out of the Great Depression, so still very high at 14%. And because of war production jobs, it drops to 2%. So positive or negative, take that as you will, okay? Okay, so the government built housing for war workers and forced civilian industries to retool for war production. This also boosted the auto industry as, tanks become more commonly used. Naval technology, the Air Force, and all of the equipment that's being used on those fronts. But yeah, so for the second half of this chapter, we will then look at how everybody in the United States was affected by the war on our home front, okay? So I will stop that for now, and I will see you guys for the second half of this chapter. Okay, if you need anything, email me, and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.